Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 11th chapter in the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to span the ranges of the 8th through the 32nd verse, 8th all the way until the end. And the reason we're starting it from the 8th as opposed to the opening verse is we feel that the opening 7 verses better connect to what the section which begins in the 12th verse of the preceding chapter, which is a call for love and obedience. So obedience is to be rooted in love in much of that material. Now, what we read of in the passage we'll be covering today is the blessings of obedience. And in fact, we have a more extensive treatment of this than in the most famous passage. I did one recently on Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. There are, I think, 24 verses we're going to cover. We don't have, and we couldn't possibly fit in all 32 in a single lesson. So we're just going to briefly review the 7 verses which come before the verses we'll be covering in detail. Verse 1, and you shall love Yahweh your Elohim and keep his charge, even his laws and his judgments and his commandments always. And you shall know today, for it is not your children who have not known, and who have not seen the discipline of Yahweh your Elohim, his greatness, his strong hand, and his outstretched arm, and his signs and his works which he had done in the midst of Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to all his land. So the motivation for love is the natural response, and they can demonstrate and prove their love through obedience to everything he commands and requires. And the generation, now Deuteronomy takes place, it is the end of the Exodus. They are a stone's throw away from entering the promised land. Moses will not enter, but many of the audience who was with him, they're the only 2 people who were born slaves in Egypt who set foot in the promised land were Joshua and Caleb. So their children did not know, they had not witnessed, they had not experienced all the miracles, the 10 plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. So it was incumbent on the elder generation to impart and instruct and to preserve and to perpetuate the memory of those events. And then verse 4 speaks of the Red Sea, how he drowned all the chariots of the army of Egypt. And verse 6, he references Dathan and Abiram, who, when the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed them up, and their households and their tents and all the living creatures that were their possessions in the midst of Israel. Now Dathan and Abiram were of the tribe of Reuben, and what they did, they joined Korah's rebellion, the Levite who tried to usurp Moses and Aaron's authority. They were aided and abetted by these Reubenites, and they were swallowed whole in the earth, much like Korah. But what's interesting is that Korah's sons survived, and we can read of this in number 16, and the sons of Korah are the author of many of the Psalms in the chapters in the book of Psalms. And in fact, the prophet Samuel was a descendant of Korah. So his children lived, but his collaborators did not. And then verse 7, for yours are the eyes that saw all the great work of Yahweh, which he did. So the responsibility for having seen what they've seen is to tell what they see, to preserve it in memory and history, so that their progeny can benefit from their witness and testimony of the miracle maker working on their behalf, and to remind them of their redemption. They had history as the slaves in Egypt, and much of the blessings of obedience are going to be liberation in the promised land. So throughout the period of Judges, they were often and frequently and cyclically oppressed by foreigners on native soil. And in Egypt, they were oppressed by, and in Babylon eventually, and in Assyria for Israel, they would be oppressed by foreigners in foreign soil. So The blessings for obedience are outlined here. Verse 8, and you shall keep every commandment which I command you today, so that you are strong, and shall go in, and shall possess the land which you are passing over to possess. So in order to claim the promised land, in order to conquer a land where there are literal giants and established civilization, people with walled cities and armies, they had to obey the commandments which were given to them that day, and that would be their source of strength through which they could set foot and walk in like they owned the place, because the land was there. It was promised to them. It was promised to their ancestor Abraham. And but it was all contingent on obedience. So the same thing we read of in the first verse, just total obedience in all its facets and all its components. Guard every command. The 5-letter word every indicates universality and totality of every. They're not to cherry pick. They cannot choose the ones for convenience or expedience. They have to obey in spite of the consequences and whatever the price may be. And to prolong your days in the land which Yahweh has sworn to give to your fathers, to them and their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. So length of life is the quality of life. Obedience adds years to your life, and life to your years. So there is a qualitative as well as a quantitative enhancement. This is not necessarily true quantitatively, or not always, but qualitatively, an obedient life is an enriching life. It is a rewarding life. There are rewards for obedience, and you will prolong your days in the land. And he's speaking to the Israelites. So the land that Yahweh swore to give your fathers, this was given to Abram, the promise that the nation would be his, this land of milk and honey. That term is familiar in Exodus chapter 3, verse 8 and 17, and throughout the Torah. So it is a land with luxurious dietary items. And remember, on the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, they were sick of manna, but they would have milk and honey in the land they came to, and they complained about all the luxurious dietary items they had as slaves in Egypt and wanted to go back. So at that moment in time, the wilderness wanderings are largely defined by failure. They refuse to embrace the challenges of freedom, preferring instead the bondage of slavery, the security of bondage. For the land which you are going in to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it by foot, as a vegetable garden. So the agricultural outgrowth in the land of Egypt was through a system of irrigation. The Nile was the lifeblood which gave life to all the crops and all the farms and all the plants and all the life forms. It was also their breadbasket. But the irrigation would come from the sky in Israel, so they wouldn't have to construct elaborate canals and dams to manipulate the water flow in order to make the most of the water which is necessary for irrigation and agriculture. But the land which you are passing over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of the heavens. So I said much of what I could have saved for in advance, in contradistinction to Egypt, which the agriculture was dependent on a system of dams and canals and everything else. This land was watered and replenished from the water from the sky, the rain of the heavens. And the rain falling from the heaven is one of this is the first time, but certainly not the last we're going to read of this, because remember, the theme of this section is the blessings for obedience, and rain is one of them. A land which Yahweh your Elohim looks after. The eyes of Yahweh your Elohim are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the latter end of the year. So the all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky never loses sight. He never sleeps or slumbers. He is always watching and always looking on this land and its people from the beginning of the year all the way to the end, 365 days a year, 24/7. He does not rest or slumber or takes break. This is a land which is of a special concern for him and his chosen people, as he has especially selected to settle and dwell and claim and live and flourish. But their flourishment and prosperity is contingent on their obedience, as is made plain consistently and repeatedly throughout this. And it shall be that if you diligently obey my commandments, which I command you today, to love Yahweh your Elohim, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. So what shall be is a promise and a blessing. If is the conditional contingent. So it all depends on if you diligently obey my commands. Diligent is not by accident. It is not by any effortlessness. It requires labor, discipline, deliberate intention, and hard work. And to obey commandments are not easy to obey, hence we must do it diligently or not do it at all. If we wish or expect to obey, we have to do so with an attitude and disposition of diligence, and the commands he commands us today. We read that phrase often throughout the book of Deuteronomy, but the ones here is to love Yahweh your Elohim and to serve him with all your heart and with all your beings. So if we love him, we will serve him. That is the proof and demonstration of our love, with all our faculties and all their capacities, with all your heart and with all your soul. So that means every element of your human nature is engaged in service towards the one you love, in obedience towards him. Then I shall give you the rain for your land in its seasons, the early rain and the latter rain, and you shall gather in your grain, and your new wine, and your oil. So in Israel, October to April represented the rainy season. That's when the rain generally fell from the sky. I think the saying in American culture is April showers bring May flowers, but it actually began raining earlier in October. So that was their sort of spring season of sorts. It was the rainy season that would be given promised, and it enabled them to gather and reap what they had sown, because the seed had to be watered, and it came from the sky and not from any irrigation system, as was the case in Egypt. And wine and oil are additional luxury items available in the land of milk and honey. And I shall give grass in your fields and for your livestock, and you shall eat and be satisfied. So they're not going to eat just to survive. They're going to eat and be satisfied. They're going to be full. They're going to have no complaints. They're going to be well fed, and they're going to have all the grass, and their livestock will flourish. They will have their every food, desire, and necessity, and even luxury satisfied and accommodated if they are obedient to the terms of the covenant. Keyword if. But satisfaction is something that he can uniquely provide. So any source of Yahweh outside of the supreme source of satisfaction can only be found in Elohim, and to seek it anywhere else is to seek it in vain, and we deserve the misery which accompanies for worshiping an inferior source of satisfaction than the supreme and sovereign one. Guard yourselves, lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other mighty ones, and bow down to them. So they had to keep a careful eye on themselves and their hearts, because the heart it is in the prophet Jeremiah's diagnosis, it is deceitful and desperately wicked. So the deceptive potential lies in every human heart. Hence we must guide our hearts with our heads. Satan wants us to think with our hearts, because if you think with your hearts, you're going to worship these attractive idols, these foreign mighty ones, and you're going to bow down to them. You're going to indulge in the sin of idolatry. And the temptation was omnipresent, because literally every other nation except Israel worshipped a polytheistic pantheon, and they worshiped through idols. But they had the commandment, and they had to have their heart controlled by their mind to avoid and stay away from that stuff. Because then the displeasure of Yahweh shall burn against you, and he shall shut up the heavens, and there be no rain, and the land not give its increase, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which Yahweh is giving you. So this isn't exclusively blessings. There are curses intermingled. So the curses and the consequences and the warning for indulging in idolatry is that you provoke the wrath of Yahweh, the almighty wrath, and he's going to demonstrate his wrath by closing the heavens of the rain. There's going to be drought. Nothing can grow, and this was not the prerogative of Baal, who is the Canaanite storm deity, the sky deity, fertility deity. He was the one they thought made the rainfall. But if they worshipped him or anyone else, then the one who really had the power and the control and the ability to make the rainfall would not waste that gift on them, because they are disobedient, and the land would not have its agricultural abundance, and they will perish quickly. They will either be exiled, removed, or just die from the good land which has been given to you. So for not making the most of the gift, it is his gift, but it doesn't belong to them without conditions. It is his gift to take away as he sees fit. As the giver of gifts, he reserves the right to remove gifts from people who are ungrateful or do not meet his demands or conditions. And you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and shall bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. So to lay the word is the words of mine in the heart and the soul. We read that word earlier in verse 13. With your heart and your soul, serve him with all your heart and all your soul. And that's what we're to do. We're to lay up these words, and place them in our heart. They are to define our thinking and our will. It is to determine our will if it is in our heart, and our soul will be saturated and fed and nourished by them. And this was a literal commandment. They shall bind them on a sign on your hand. These were known as phylacteries, and frontlets between their eyes. These are also more officially known as phylacteries. Most frequently written was the Shema, the central confession of Jewish monotheism we read of in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is one, Yahweh is Elohim. And you shall teach them to your children, speaking to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, and shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children are increased in the land in which Yahweh swore to your fathers to give them, as the days of the heavens on the earth. So this information, this special revelation, the Israelites were unique and privileged to be the unique benefactors and recipients of special revelation, and the duty and obligation was to preserve and perpetuate it through education, instruction, and teaching of the next generation, who would carry the torch to the next generation. The Jewish people have survived for over 5,000 centuries because these miracles have been preserved in this book and been taught from father to son, and then their son to their son and their son to their son, just all the way until now. And, when you're in your house or by your way where you're lying down, and when you rise up, whatever your physical position is no barrier, deterrent, or excuse not to teach what needs to be taught. And it's all about increasing the days qualitatively and quantitatively in the promised land that has been given, and they're to write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. The doorpost, they marked it in Egypt. They marked their doorposts with the lamb's blood. In the promised land, they were to mark their doorposts with the word of Yahweh, the most common one of which was the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. For if you diligently keep all these commandments which I command you to do it, to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all his ways, and to cling with him, then Yahweh shall drive out these nations before you, and you shall dispossess greater and stronger nations to them. So there's that word again, diligently. There's nothing haphazard about obedience to dictates and commands. These are commandments are the reason that Yahweh communicates through commandments, and rather than trying to persuade us through argument, is because the things he asks us to do are hard, and if he appealed to our reason, we could weasel our way out of that. But if we diligently obey these commandments and love, we will prove our love by walking in his ways and clinging to him. We are to cling to him as a husband does to a wife. That term is familiar in the Edenic account. A man and a wife exist to cling to them. That is the act of love, of mutuality, where two become one. And in the covenant terms, Israel was the wife. They were married to Yahweh, much in the same way that the New Testament people, the church is the bride, and the Messiah is the bridegroom. But if they do this, if they honor their end of the bargain, then all these nations, there are several, there are seven, there are Hittites, there are Canaanites, there are Perizzites, there are Philistines, there are all sorts of people in the land, and many of them are greater and stronger. They have walled cities, armies, established locations. Some of them have literal giants. But even though they are greater and stronger than you, no one or nothing is stronger than Yahweh. So when you have an ally like that on your side, the size of an army or an opponent is irrelevant. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads is yours, from the wilderness in Lebanon, from near the river Euphrates, even from the western sea is your border. So wherever they set foot on, that land becomes theirs. Whether they enter in as conquerors, and they will prevail over these stronger and greater nations. They will displace them and dispossess them. And the territories of their promised land, the eastern extremity is the desert. That's the wilderness. The northern extremity, west of the Jordan River, or actually just the desert. That's what wilderness means. Lebanon is the neighboring nation to the north, known in ancient terms as Phoenicia, and the river Euphrates. Now, Israel has never occupied the full extent of this promise, but the western sea is the Mediterranean Sea. So those were the borders and physical parameters of the promised land they were about to set foot and enter into, claim, and conquer. No man shall stand against you. Yahweh your Elohim shall put the dread of you and the fear of you upon all the land where you tread, as he has spoken to you. So Yahweh's promise, Yahweh's word is as good as gold. He is an intrinsically honest being. There is no promise that he cannot fulfill. So when he says something, when he says that no man nor group of men, no nation will oppose you, resist you successfully, but they will fear you and dread you on the land where you enter, and they will conquer those who are afraid of them. See, I am putting before you today a blessing and a curse. So there's this dichotomy. There's the balance. Life consists of a balance of blessings and curses. And in the covenant terms, blessings are inextricably linked and connected to obedience, curses for sin and disobedience. The blessing when you obey the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, but turn aside from the way which I am commanding you today, to go after other mighty ones which you have not known. So the dichotomy is self-evidently clear. Blessings stem from obedience to the commandments which are commanded today. We find that phrase throughout the book of Deuteronomy, and the commandments that he was speaking today are in some sense eternally binding. They remain in operation in the Jewish community, not 100% in the Christian community. We don't have time to dissect what parts of the law have been fulfilled by the Messiah, are still in operation in Matthew 5:17. But the curses come from failure to obey and to turn aside from the way. Now, to turn aside, now sin is from a Greek archery term for missing the mark. So when we turn away, that means we miss the mark of God's intentions, God's standards, God's commandments. He commands. He wants what's best for us, and that's why he commands the things he does. But if you follow a spiritually inferior entity or deity, which you have not known, they have known Yahweh, he has made himself known, he has intervened dramatically and miraculously in their life. So to forsake him for this attractive idol, this foreign entity, is invites curses, because it is an egregious act of disobedience and hatred, in fact. And it shall be, when Yahweh your Elohim has brought you into the land which you go to possess, that you shall put the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Now, Mount Gerizim was a hill that was to the west of Shechem. It was the future site of the Samaritan temple, and Mount Ebal was across the valley of Mount Gerizim. It was to the east of Shechem, and we can read of the blessings and curses. We read of Mount Ebal in Deuteronomy 27, so it's interesting. He anticipates it in advance, and we read of the blessings, and so this takes us to Deuteronomy 27 and 28. But the blessings and curses are pronounced, and much of the material that we read in here is reiterated, if not repeated, in those two chapters. Are they not beyond the Jordan, following the way of the sun westward, in the land of the Canaanites, who dwell in the desert plain opposite Gilgal, beside the terebinth trees of Moreh? So Gilgal was the first camp of the Israelites in Canaan. Once they set foot in there, we can read of this in Joshua 4:19. It was 2 miles to the northwest of the city of Jericho, which they overtook as promised. Jericho was a mighty walled city. Israel had pitchforks, but they obeyed Yahweh. They circled the city once a day, then 7 times on the final day, then blew the trumpets, and the walls came crumbling down. And Moreh was near Shechem. It was Abram, as he was then known, first camp in Canaan. We can read of this in Genesis 12:6, and is also the same site where Jacob buried Laban's idols, his father-in-law's, in Genesis 35, verse 4. So these places are real, and they are referenced throughout Scripture. For you are passing over the Jordan to go possess the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, and you shall possess it and dwell in it. So that this is the fact, this is their current state of existence. They are passing over the Jordan. The Jordan River is the western boundary and extremity of the Promised Land, even though strictly speaking it is the river Euphrates. Realistically, the western extremity was the river Jordan, but the land to the west of that was the land that Yahweh was giving to them, and they will possess it and dwell in it. And not only that, and shall guard to do all the laws and all the judgments which I am putting before you today. So what he was telling them today, they were to live by once they lived in the land, once they settled there, once they entered into a land which they did not it was solely an act of grace that they had this land. They were an enslaved people, overtaking without formal siege equipment, just these lands and nations greater and mightier than them. But they were a force to be reckoned with, in as much as they remained obedient to the commandments of Yahweh. And this history of Israel is scattered, it's inconsistent, but the blessings were always there when they obeyed, and the curses and the exile were the consequences of their disobedience. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.